Okay, so it's been a while since I've done one of these. We, of course, haven't been meeting because of the COVID issue, but we still have a few sessions that I haven't discussed yet. So this is my home group. We haven't been able to meet for, I guess, my third group. Again, we have only met once. I don't think I've talked about their session yet. It was quite similar to my other first rounds, with a few exceptions here and there. But my home group has gotten quite a bit further, and last we left off, they had just gotten into the ballroom and kind of gotten scolded by the teacher for constantly wandering outside of the school grounds, even though it's only the first week. So after that, they slept and they started their second in-game week, and they attended the lectures. Now, I've been doing different lectures for different groups, so that's why you kind of see these, like, names attached to some of the lectures so that I can kind of keep track of who's, like, good at certain lectures. I try to put those ones in there and take the ones out that nobody has a skill in, I suppose. Just to make it so that everybody feels important in my group. So my home group got the lessons in flying, which somebody was at the time. And they got a lesson in astronomy. And then they got a lesson in history of magic there. And I think I already talked to you guys about what happened in the history of magic session. With my other group, and I basically played it out the same way in this group, though it went a little bit better in group 2 than my home group. I don't know if it's because maybe I have people that are a little more creative in that group or whatnot, but my first group liked that little puzzle a little bit better. Essentially, I want the lectures for my players to have one lecture has a puzzle, one lecture has combat, and then I'm kind of flexible with the third one. Maybe it's just a lecture, maybe I'll add something else in there, depending on how much time I have that night. So the flying lesson was about transportation magic, and the need for it in the wizarding world and how they need to upgrade their forms of transportation. I think something that I wanted to put into this Hogwarts world was that the world needed to develop further. Like, why are they still using quills? Because those are really annoying compared to pens. Like, why aren't they upgrading their technology to kind of match the conveniences that it brings, even if it's not technically magical? So I kind of wanted to add that element that they needed to move forward with some of their development. But it didn't directly have anything to do with the story. It does flesh out the Harry Potter world with, like, tasty little made-up details, though. So, but flying was the combat lesson, which ended up being really fun. The players had to grab a broom that wasn't completely broken in yet. See, I talked about how transportation magic takes some finagling. You have to break it in, kind of, like horses, I guess. But yeah, the players had to grab a broom that wasn't completely broken in, and they had to do combat with their fellow students in the air with it. The teacher created safety shields for the players that equaled the character's hit pool, and once the shield popped, they were out of the game. So again, like a safety form of combat for students. And then players, if they were hit with a spell or like took damage, they had to make a check to see if they could keep control of their brooms. And if they couldn't, it would dump them onto the cloud charm that she had put on the ground to protect them from fall damage. And then I did have a player that decided that, well, why do I even try to fly? Like, I'll just do combat from this weird cloud thing on the ground. And the teacher, of course, yelled at her, saying that the whole lesson was for them to break in these brooms. So she tried to be clever and just stay on the ground. My other students were near the same level as my players, of course, because they're technically in the same class. So essentially they use the same spells, but they did have some options that the players hadn't bought yet, like they were on their shopping chart and they hadn't purchased them yet. So I had my enemies use those against my players so that the players could kind of see what they do and see them in action. I tried to do a sweet combo spell. It's the one up here. I tried to do Produce Flame and Thorn Whip, like have the two enemies work together to do that, but I ended up rolling a 1 and then I crit after the 1, which meant that she knocked herself off of her broom and out of the arena, so she was disqualified. I'll talk a little bit more about how I decide to house rule critical successes and failures. I'll talk about that later. Everybody kind of has their own thing. It depends on what you want to do. But I like creating circumstances that affect the game based on that. But doing combat with an extra dimension can be kind of hard depending on your player's desire to move around. I generally keep everyone on the same field level unless there is a special circumstance like falling off a broom in this case. But you lead by example in this. I've got like a chart pulled up. I used My Little Pony figures, so I hope you guys don't judge me. So like, let's say that this is the playing field, right? Oh, the ground, we'll make the ground down here. So that's the ground. And then, like, say that they're up in the air, or, you know, this applies to swimming too, if they're doing swimming. And then this would be like their playing field. So this is technically in space. They can move everywhere. This line isn't here, but I try to keep, since you're leading by example, I try to keep my monsters, like, just moving. Oh no, Spike. He's attached to everything. Moving back and forth just along this line. And that usually ends up keeping my players doing the same thing, which is nice. And that's essentially, yeah, his line. Okay, well, that's life. So, like, let's say my character, you know, got hit and then rolled poorly on their broom check, then they would fall to the ground. And that's the only time I would use that weird, like, up-down axis for the combat. And then they would get back up and go to the same playing field. You could also, I mean, I didn't have them do this, but, like, if my monster were to, like, go up and dive bomb, like, I would maybe indicate that they're going up, but they look really determined and like they're picking up speed, right? And then that would be a clue to the characters that maybe they should target him or get in the way or distract them. But, like, they wouldn't be staying up here to fight. They would be dive bombing to the same level. Now, you can't, like, control if your players are wild and they're like, I want to go up here and I just want to fly around and be wild and just play down here. Like, you can't control all of that, but you can put, like, limits. So, like, if my players had tried to go up here, the professor would have been like, no, you need to stay in the grounds or whatever, fighting. So most people also understand that dealing with the axis is kind of difficult to conceptualize, especially if you're using a battle map and you don't have a way of, like, raising the character up on a platform. So usually I just have them play on the same field, and I just use the conditional circumstances for the up or down, just to give combat a little bit more flavor. The astronomy lesson was next, and it was there to teach them specifically about rituals and how I kind of have rituals functioning. This was really important for the story since the thing affecting the dark arts teacher isn't a curse in my world, but it's an unfinished ritual. Players learned that unfinished rituals can have adverse effects and can seem like a curse. This is a really big piece of information for them to have the solution be solvable, I guess, for the players. So hopefully they took notes and they wrote that down. Though, of course, I can easily put new pieces of information in the game in case they might have forgotten that to kind of reaffirm this. After that, flying, astronomy, history of magic, which I already talked about. For the lectures, it's also really important to encourage players to kind of speculate and guess too. Like, again, they aren't going to know the exact answer most of the time because they didn't read a textbook. I want my players to have fun with it, so it's important to give players points for even wrong guesses. Just maybe a little bit less than somebody that had gotten it right, so that they're still encouraged to keep trying. I did give my players the option to wander around the school in between classes like I did for the first week, but they didn't really do anything groundbreaking. One visited a boy outside the Defense Against the Dark Arts trying to figure out the runes the teacher had been placing on the windows. This event was kind of like a wing it flavor encounter. Another player went to go visit Moaning Myrtle. She is planned in here. I've got, something specifically for Moaning Myrtle, wherever she is in this giant list of things. Second floor. Yeah, this is Moaning Myrtle. So it was a male player that went up and talked to Moaning Myrtle, but and she gave them the clue that the piping that used to connect to the Chamber of Secrets also connects the staff bathroom down below, and that hasn't been fixed yet. So basically saying, P.S., you can get into a secret passageway if you go to the staff bathrooms, but they totally didn't get it. So that was a bust. I don't know if they will ever find that passageway, or if maybe another player will go talk to Moaning Myrtle. But yes, so they unfortunately didn't follow that lead. And then another player went to the Owlry, but it was in between classes, so she didn't have a ton of time to look around and study it. I think the last person just went and hung out with the potions professor. So she's been lingering over there because she's good at potions. So as a DM, I'm trying to find ways to reward her for going and developing a relationship with him. He is connected to the werewolf downstairs, though, so she might be able to gain information on that. So on the weekend, I went and posted things on a billboard in their common room. It would be similar to what players would find in a standard tavern in a medieval setting for a Dungeons and Dragons. I kind of wanted to create that similar choice option. That was here. So I usually, when their weekend starts, I have a little excerpt thing that I read to them. Again, it's not super long. It's really important not to bore your players with exposition. That's the word. But I did have 3 options that they could choose from. They could get pests away from Hagrid's pumpkins. They could go fix the bed bug problem in the hospital. They were so grossed out by this. I get that it's gross, but it wasn't in beds that were being used. Though they don't know that yet, so they were just grossed out by it. And then Professor Sprout's expedition, of course, this one led them into the Forbidden Forest, very lucrative, so they, of course, went to do that one. And that one took up 2 time slots, so that was their entire first weekend day. I I was glad too because I wanted them to get more combat in, particularly for that day. Again, I try to have about 50-50 story and combat in my games. This also allowed me to introduce them to the berries the owls eat in order to guide the dead. Now, this is a complex story element, so the more I show them about it, the better. A slow repeat feed of complex informations will help my players connect all of my story dots, which I know I sometimes make too complicated, so I'm totally aware. They also got a handful of combats without rest in between the combat, and that was a perfect way for me to gauge my character's resources. If you don't often do that as a DM, consider maybe doing a few combats in a row just to check how your players are doing with resources. If they have too much or if they can't hack more than one combat, you might want to consider adjusting what you give them or finding ways to take things away or make them consume resources. So yeah, that was really helpful for me since this is basically a playtest. But they also went with a teacher and 2 other high-level students, which allowed me to make combat a little bit harder for them so that the other people could help out. Steering, the problem was, of course, I'm sending 3 NPCs with them, and steering and controlling NPCs that are accompanying your players can be really tough. At least that I found. First off, they are so easy to forget as you're trying to run all of your players' actions and questions and combat turns. Second, you also have to know what they will probably know. And you certainly have to know what they don't know. And that's hard to word. But your players will often try to dig for information from your NPCs. Or, try to get them to help in ways that you never intended them to help. And you don't want the puzzle to be too easy. You don't want the story to be too easy. So you can't just feed them all of the, questions and help that they want through these NPCs. So you have to know how to write, stop your players from pressuring your NPCs too much, I guess. So yeah, NPCs can be tough if you want them to accompany most of the time just because they're easy to forget when you're doing other things as a dungeon master. There are a few solutions to that. Usually I will write up a little excerpt on how they have specialty formats in combat. One of the high-level people that I sent with them uses exploding origami birds to combat things. So making that cool, unique format helped me remember her turn, and I, of course, rolled initiative for them so that they would also help. But she was also kind of snooty, so I gave her a personality, and that helped me remember her too. Making sure you develop the NPC a little bit so that they make an impression in your own mind. But she did have information. Those origami exploding birds were awesome, and my players were like, teach me how to do that, it's so cool. But they didn't warm themselves up to her very much at the beginning. They were a little snotty themselves, so she wasn't interested in teaching them, thank goodness, because it's too tough of a spell for them anyways. But yeah, so just make sure that you leave an impression in your mind of your own creation so that you remember that they're there. Or you can have one of your characters steer the NPC. Sometimes that gives them something a little extra to do if you notice that they're not good at paying attention or they get kind of bored. Having another person to steer might keep them entertained, but you would have to come up with a little combat block for them. So that a little bit extra work on your part initially. Though again, it would be easier to do in the long run during the session. So some options that you can have for that. But yeah, so they went through the expedition. I have first they had to sneak through the forest. They might run into bats, which they did. Or they might get their feet burned if they failed on their nature check, which they did. And then they were supposed to harvest the moss from the trees gently, and they didn't. So they got yelled at from the professor again because they were using gouging spells to take the moss off. And then they collected a nice chunk of moss, but on the way back, Professor Sprout did warn them that this could be dangerous. There are these thorny bushes, which they're on my combat page here. If you guys don't use OneNote, there's like this screen clipping tool here, that's how I get all of these panels. I have the Dungeons and Dragons like PDFs, but I also love going on Pinterest and finding a bunch of homebrew creations. They're really great. I love the homebrew stuff. So this one is homebrew. This is the pest setter in Hagrid's garden, but this and I don't remember if these two are homebrew or not. Swarm of Bats is not, but this is basically what they ran into. They ran into the bats, which I did not make them a swarm. Swarms are just so hard to fight. They're immune to like everything, or resistant, and that's really frustrating from a player's perspective. I've been there. So I try not to use that very often, especially if I'm not putting it with another monster that doesn't have those resistances. So they ran into Thorny, which I just made into a little bush. And then the gazer was hiding inside the thorn bush. And once they got close enough and they woke up the gazer, I just made it a spore ball. It woke up and then started using all of its beams on them. And it would specifically target the player that had the most moss because it likes the moss. So they might have done really great in that skill challenge, but then now all the monsters are targeting them. So you win some, you lose some. That was the combat that I kind of realized that my players don't have enough spell resources. I wasn't giving them enough charges for their spells. So that's something that I fixed going forward. But yeah, that's how their session ended up ending, I think, after they came out of the forest. And I guess I'll talk about what happened to the second day after that, because I have to go back and remember. It's been kind of a long time. But if you guys, I put a link to my PDF or my OneNote document so that you guys can view it in one of the replies, which you guys are welcome to go view and use. Like, I'm fairly certain that everything I have here is copyright because I'm using Harry Potter things, I'm using Dungeons and Dragons things and whatever, so everything's free. Oh, and all the music that I do is probably copyright too, the planning things, because people do great music and they let me use it and they're really nice. So yeah, I'll talk about the next session another time.